Good morning, everyone. At least it's morning here on the Pacific Coast of the United States. Thank you for joining us. My name is Tim Mather. I'm a former Chief Security Strategist at RSA, former CISO at Symantec, co-author, of course, of Cloud Security and Privacy. And I'm joined by my two co-authors today, Subra Kumaraswamy and Shahed Latif, who will also be speaking. Our format today is that we're going to spend 30 minutes going into some depth on three topics. And I will be starting that out with data security. I'll be followed by Subra, who's going to talk about identity and access management. And then Shahed will be talking about audit and compliance and some of the things that you, prospective customers of cloud computing, should be thinking about as you move towards the cloud or think about moving towards the cloud. We're going to allow question time at the end of each presentation. We encourage your questions, please. So ask them as we go. We will try and answer some of them online as we go, and some of them we will save for, in effect, a group discussion at the end of each presentation. Before we actually start today, we have two polling questions that we'd like you to respond to quickly, and this gives us, the presenters, some feel for where you, the audience, are as far as potential uptake on the cloud. So Catherine has just opened up the first polling question there, and if you could take a look at those and see if you are using the cloud, what is your primary use for that? You may check more than one of those, but please at least let us know what your primary is. So if you could go ahead and vote on that, please, and then we'll have some idea of where we are on that. There'll be a second polling question, and then we're going to jump right into the presentations themselves. So you've got about 30 seconds, please, left to go ahead and answer the question. And as soon as that poll closes out, then Catherine will bring up the results for us. And this will give us some idea, as well as you, about where folks are, at least on this call, with regards to uptake in the cloud. Okay, and the poll is now closed, and Catherine will bring up those results for us here. And we're curious to see who is using the cloud, and if you are using the cloud, what you're using it for.
Okay, just a few more seconds. It's closing out the results. And we should see them in just a moment. It's taking a minute to tally. All right. It's sorry, Tim, it's taking a moment to tally this. Do you want to open the other polls while this tallies, and then we'll show those?
Sure. Please, go ahead,
Okay.
Catherine. Yeah, let's open the second polling question.
Okay.
This will be our second and last polling question, and again, we're just trying to get a feel for where you, the audience, might be. For those of you who are using the cloud today, meaning your enterprise or your organization is using the cloud, not you personally, not consumer use of the cloud, but enterprise or organizational use of the cloud, if you are using it today, how many users do you have in your organization who are actually using that? So if you could go ahead and answer those. And again, we've got about 1 minute total, so about 30 seconds left if you could answer that. And once this closes out, then we'll look at the results of these two. And this gives us, the presenters, as well as you, the audience, some idea of where folks are as far as adoption of the cloud. At least for the folks on the call, of course. So. Okay, and that poll is finished, and okay, we got the answers to question 2 here. How many of you are using that? No answer, meaning you're not using it. Interesting. So fairly small use. Only 14% there, over 1,000 users. Interesting. So it looks like we have quite a few folks who are in effect dabbling or learning about the cloud in a small scale way, and not many of you who have moved to the cloud. And let's go back, please, Catherine, to the answers for question 1, and let's get some feel for how folks who are using the cloud, what are they using it for?
All right. For some reason, this is just not coming up, Tim. I'm sorry.
Okay. Well, we'll move along then and get into our first deep dive. We're just trying to get used to that. Maybe, Catherine, if you can work that offline, and at the end of the call, then we'll look at that real quick when we take questions.
Yes.
Okay, so let's go ahead then and move to the first slide here, and we've got that. I should say, I'm sorry, before we start here, we just want to set some context with you, the listeners here, about a potential case study that we're going to try and walk through today to let you know that we're trying to be realistic about what we talk about today, and this isn't necessarily a theoretical or abstract question here. And I can see that Catherine has just put up the results here for the first question here. And interesting, so storage, about 20%, application, 25%, infrastructure augmentation. Okay, very, very interesting here. I'm a little surprised that CRM is not higher than it is, but that's quite interesting. Okay, and that gives you, the folks on the call, some idea of what your potential peers might be doing in the cloud or, as well. So, okay, very good. Thank you, Catherine. As I was saying here, what we're talking about is, as far as the cloud is concerned, is the fact that what we want to talk about here is some case study, some real-world example here. And so theoretically, what we're talking about today is an organization that may be an enterprise, that may be a government entity, that may be an academic institution, but an entity that is using some degree of Amazon Web Services for IaaS or infrastructure as a service. This may be EC2, for example, from Amazon, their Elastic Cloud Computing. We have them using Google's platform for platform as a service, and that would be App Engine. And then at the top level of the stack, if you will, for cloud computing, software as a service at the top level. Our notional entity here is using Salesforce.com and Workday. Most of you are probably familiar with Salesforce.com, who is a CRM, our customer relationship management vendor, a very prominent one in this space, and Workday, who does HR, or human resources management in the cloud. So again, we're going to try, just keep this in the back of your mind so that as we walk through today our scenario, we're going to try and talk about these, or this in the context of examples that we bring up. So that said, let's jump into our first topic here. And again, my name is Tim Mather, and we're going to talk about, in this first section, data security. Okay, so when we talk about data security here in the cloud, one of the things that we should, of course, talk about is confidentiality. And we'll start with that because for those of you who are information security practitioners, I'm going to follow the CIA model. That is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So we're going to start with confidentiality. And what does that mean as far as the use of encryption today? Well, first off, we should note that since we are in the cloud, and in our example here, we're talking for all of us today, we're referencing public clouds as opposed to private clouds. So our talk is directed towards public cloud, though the issues apply somewhat, though mitigated, to private clouds as well. So in a public cloud here, where trust boundaries have moved, where data separation is entirely logical, there is no longer any physical separation of data between you and other customers of cloud service providers, or CSPs, you should certainly be using encryption. Now, we all know how to do point-to-point encryption of data in transit. We've been doing that for years. Think about SSL, Secure Sockets Layer, or TLS, Transport Level Security. The issue, therefore, is not point-to-point encryption. The issue in the cloud environment becomes how feasible, how viable is point-to-multi-point encryption for data in transit. The issue here is trying to do that on a scalable basis. Not only do you need the security of that when you're uploading or downloading data from the cloud and you're trying to do that from multiple nodes in the cloud, but how scalable is the solution that you're doing? I'm aware of only one product out there that claims to do point-to-multi-point encryption for data in transit, and the scalability of that product really is questionable when it comes to the cloud. If you're using 25 nodes or less, this company says, yes, they can accommodate that. The question, therefore, is, are you really using only 25 nodes in the cloud at a time to upload or download your data? And the answer to that probably is no. So point-to-multi-point encryption of data in transit is an issue that you should consider if you're moving to the cloud. Can you actually do that? Do not necessarily assume that data at rest that you have in the cloud is encrypted. That would likely be a bad assumption. Just because the data is in the cloud does not necessarily mean that your cloud provider is encrypting that data. You definitely need to check on that. Is the cloud service provider or CSP doing that on your behalf, or are they expecting you to do that? Definitely an issue that you want to, again, check into. Today, if your data is being processed in the cloud, if you're doing any sort of processing in the cloud, your data is definitely not encrypted. There is no method today that is in widespread use to be able to, to process encrypted data. It must be decrypted to be processed. So anyway, so I would definitely take a look at that, about that. Now, there's a future capability here, which I'll talk about in just a moment. And what this highlights then is that what should be an expanded use of encryption today in the cloud, it points to a weakness that already exists. And in fact, that weakness gets even worse, and that's key management. Key management is a significant issue because of scalability. It is very difficult to do key management effectively today in an enterprise, and therefore even harder to do it in the cloud at that scale. It just is not there. There are a whole number of problems about that, and I'm going to get to that in just a moment. So when we talk about key management, where are we today? Well, frankly, we're in a proprietary mess. There are numerous key management solutions from vendors that are out there today. The issue is that almost all of those use a proprietary client-to-server protocol for their key management. So they can talk to point products from a specific key management server as long as they're their own. There is, in effect, no cross communication between the key management systems that are out there today, again, because of the use of proprietary client-to-server protocols. Now, there is work being done on this. Under OASIS, there is a Key Management Interoperability Protocol Working Group, KMIP, which is working on this and has put out, or has a draft standard for unified key management, which involves the use of a standardized clients to servers protocol, which then allows for interoperability between various clients and servers. And this is a big step forward. For enterprise computing, this is much needed, and it's a good thing that OASIS is working on this with KMIP. And again, that's Key Management Interoperability Protocol. So good job to them, and that would be a former colleague of mine who actually heads up that working group, Bob Griffin. So good work there. The issue is that is really solving an enterprise problem, but that doesn't really scale to solve a cloud problem. What we really need for the cloud is federated identity management, and there's not much that's being done here, not by standards organizations today. What we really need is use of a standardized server-to-server protocol in addition to what OASIS is working on with KMIP, which again standardizes the client-to-server protocol. But we need to build on that with key management that is federated. And the only folks that I'm aware of today who are actually talking this up and pushing for this are folks from Voltage Security, and good for them for doing so. So key management today remains a significant problem. Now, in the works, what looks promising for confidentiality is IBM's discovery in June of last year of fully homomorphic encryption. And what that is the ability to process encrypted data. So this is a huge step forward, and kudos to IBM for actually doing this for that. So this is no longer theoretical. It is now realistic, at least as far as some scale is concerned. The question is, how viable is fully homomorphic encryption for cloud scale? And that remains very much in doubt right now. So on a smaller scale, again, kudos to IBM for actually achieving this. This has been a long-sought goal within the mathematical and cryptographic community, and good job to them for doing that. But now it needs to be viable to cloud scale. There's also some work that's being done out of UCLA called predicate encryption, which is asymmetric encryption, which involves the use of multiple public keys for a private key so that you can have different parties be able to see part of data that's encrypted. Think about a medical scenario where an individual is hurt and that individual has his or her medical records encrypted, and an ambulance driver or EMT may be able to see part of the information, an admitting nurse may be able to see part of the information, and a doctor who treats you may be able to see all of the information. So predicate encryption is certainly something that looks promising, but again, that remains theoretical. That is not really a reality yet. It's getting there, but not yet. So what is not acceptable today? Well, certainly there are some folks out there, who are advocating alternative methods for protection of data. For example, obfuscation, redaction, truncation. And I'm sorry, but in my opinion, those are frankly just complete nonsense. They're certainly not adequate for sensitive, regulated, or classified information. And my reason for saying that is that there are no standards around any of those other alternative methods that are being advocated, such as obfuscation. Certainly when it comes to redaction, we saw a recent example of this, of where redaction failed, partly because there are no standards. And I think everyone in the United States is at least aware of the recent flap over a TSA, Transportation Security Administration, security manual that was published on the internet that was supposed to be redacted and in fact was not adequately redacted. So talk of these alternative methods being acceptable is in my opinion, not acceptable, and in fact it borders on nonsense. And this comes up occasionally in legislation that's proposed by the U.S. Congress as well. The Data Accountability and Trust Act is yet one example of that. So let's move to data integrity here, our I in CIA. One of the issues here is the ability to do data lineage. For those of you who have had the pleasure of going through a SOX audit, you're familiar with the requirement to be able to essentially trace or prove the lineage of your data. Where did it come into your enterprise? Where was it stored? Where was it processed? How was it reported? Out of what systems, et cetera? The ability to follow your data as it moves through your enterprise and ensure the integrity of that data as it does move through your enterprise. Well, that's hard enough to do in the enterprise, but to try and do that in a cloud environment where you, the customer, have maybe a vague notion of where your data is stored, for example, Eastern United States or Western United States, and no information on exactly which data center, let alone exactly which server or system that data is on, and trying to do data lineage to your satisfaction and certainly to your auditor's satisfaction is problematic, to say the least. And if you can't do data lineage, then you really can't do data provenance as well, for those of you who might need to prove the validity and the accurateness of any calculations that you might do on data that's in the cloud, whether that be calculations related to financial transactions, as an example, or calculations related to scientific processing. Think about pharma, for example, and trying to prove that test results out of certain drugs that are being tested is actually correct as well. So data integrity becomes a problem here as well. Moving to availability in our CIA model here, the availability issue is not only available of your data to you, is your data actually backed up in the cloud? And there have, of course, unfortunately been examples already with cloud providers either losing data or going out of business and not making the data readily available to their customers. How available is your data to you? Then we move to the issue of how available is your data to anyone else who might be in the cloud. Again, the issue here is the fact that data is no longer physically separated from other data belonging to other customers in the cloud. All of that separation is logical, and therefore, how do you ensure that your data, when you pull it down from the cloud and you think it's no longer there, is actually no longer there? How is that data being securely wiped to the satisfaction of you and your auditors? So data remnants becomes an issue, and that, of course, falls under availability. And in this case, you'd like it not to be available, but it may be actually to other folks. There was a very good paper in IEEE Security and Privacy that talks about this problem in some detail in the July-August issue. And so if you're concerned about data remnants and how that is actually done securely, would advise you to take a look at that particular document. So again, when we're talking about data security, it's data availability. There's also the availability of the CSP's customer data that's relevant to you. The CSPs probably have quite a bit of data that they're using for security management and security monitoring, and there may be an incident or some investigation of yours which would which would possibly require you to get your hands on that data. Now, in today's enterprise environment, that's probably not an issue. You probably have that data readily available to you. But when you move to the cloud, is that security data that your CSP has available to you? And it's likely that it's not. And it's likely that it's not for two reasons. Number one is, even though the CSP or cloud service provider is collecting that data, just because you ask for it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get it. Your data is now, what you think is your data is now commingled with all of the other customers' data that's related to security monitoring and security management. So the ability of the CSP or cloud service provider to actually disaggregate that data from their SIM, or Security Incident and Event Management System, is problematic. There's not only a need for SIM products to be able to disaggregate that data for multiple customers, but of course the SIM has to actually be able to scale to the cloud as well. And both of those are in question on that. So again, from an availability perspective, those are some issues that you should consider. Now, before I close, of course, I want to take some of your questions, and we've had several of them that have come up on that. So let me just address those real quick.
So Tim, this is Shahid. I've just been monitoring the chat line, and there's a number of key questions coming up, so I'd like to pose them to you, and perhaps we can take them one at a time, not in any order, but I'll just start with the bottom one. What is the product that you were talking about? You mentioned the point-to-point encryption is easy, but now there's this one product you're referring to that allows point-to-many points?
Yes, there is one product that I'm aware of that allows for point-to-multi-point encryption of data in transit that may be applicable to the cloud. Unfortunately, when I talked to them a couple of months ago, that was limited to 25 nodes. The name of that company is Cohesive FT, Cohesive Frank Tom. So might want to think about that. The name of that's the name of the company. The product is actually called VPN Cubed.
Okay, thanks, Tim. I'm not sure we can answer this question, but I'll pose it to you. We did some research quickly as well, Tim, but if you have views on it, because it's more of a consumer-oriented question, I think. But MobileMe is an Apple product. Is there any level of encryption in the use of MobileMe?
Well, I have to plead ignorance here, because even though I'm familiar with Macs and with Apple, I don't actually use MobileMe, so I don't know if it does or not.
We did a quick look at the blog sites in there, and I'm not sure we can rely upon it. So I think at this stage, I don't think we're in a position to answer it. It's very much a consumer-oriented question anyway, and the flavor of today is more about enterprise issues. That's
correct. Yeah, we're focusing on the enterprise today. So good question. Thank you about MobileMe, but I'm frankly not in a position to answer that right now.
Okay, we'll try to speak a little bit louder as well. So the other question was, I talked a lot about integrity protection and thoughts around protecting data, but one particularly participant said, I'm worried about malicious change of data, a hacker just going out there and changing the data. Can you talk a little bit further about what measures can be done to prevent that or even monitor or detect for that?
Well, there's a couple of things out there. Number one is there is use of encryption, as I talked about, will help to ensure that the data cannot be altered without alerting you to the fact that it has been changed if you correct it. Now, that's not true for all encryption, not all symmetric encryption, streaming encryption, for example, but block encryption will not decrypt properly if someone has tried to alter the data after it has been encrypted. So you do have some integrity protection there as far as encrypted data in the cloud, as long as it's done with symmetric encryption that is block encryption, that provides you with that. Now, in case that someone has tried to maliciously change that data, that argues for the point of why you need a backup copy for that. Now, the question then becomes, I think, is the data, so you don't have to pull the data down from the cloud to ensure that it actually does have integrity. Is there a way to check that data for integrity while it still remains in the cloud? And the answer is yes. There is some work that has been done by RSA in this regard, and it's gosh, I've got to get Dr. Ari Jules has worked on this, and it's proofs of retrievability that this relates to, where it's a way to check data that's in the cloud and see if the data has actually been has actually been altered in the cloud. So proofs of retrievability, again, is something that you might want to look into with regards to integrity protection in the cloud. Dr. Ari Jules from RSA has worked on that, and I know that he's got a paper out on that with some other folks as well, so I would check into that.
Okay, Tim, another question. The cloud service providers, you talked about availability. Do you know whether they keep data off-site or not? For GRP purposes? Well,
that is a good question, and it's something that you need to check with your cloud service provider or CSP about. I can't speak for all of them, and I wouldn't want to make a blanket statement that they do or do not, but that's a very good question that you as a prospective customer of a CSP should be asking them about their own policies and capabilities with regards to backups of the data and how they ensure the availability of that themselves.
I can tell you from my own experiences, Tim, when I've worked with some of the cloud service providers, and I won't say which, but they they spend a huge amount of investments on fault tolerance, on high availability. So if a particular instance was to go down, it would flip in microseconds to another instance. The issue, though, of data integrity, if it gets compromised, is a very important issue. I think the volume of data that they have is, I think, a case-by-case merit where you have a service option if you want it to have. It costs extra, I think, is some of the strategies of providers.
And again, even though it's on the consumer side, we unfortunately have a recent example of a provider who did not do a good job in this regard at all, and that's, I'm sure you all recall, the company was Danger, which is owned by Microsoft, and they're losing data for many Sidekick customers. So again, it's a good question, and certainly one that you need to have on the top of your list or near the top of your list to ask CSPs when you talk with them about prospective use of their services.
So Tim, we have another question about SIM, Security Incident Event Monitoring, for those that may not be familiar with the acronym. The question here is, while SIM is being used today in each company and in their organization, however, cloud service providers may use it in a very disaggregated way, right? They may use it for whatever reasons, maybe more internal, it could be internal and external. What's your thought on, is the preference to have it both sides, one side? What's the strategy around how we would adopt SIM in the cloud environment?
Well, I think, first of all, the question is with regards to where is SIM installed by a CSP or cloud service provider. If it's installed on their own internal network, that doesn't do you, the customer, any good. The SIM needs to be installed, of course, on the cloud network that the CSP is offering to their customers. So again, the question then becomes one of where is it deployed? Two, even though it's deployed there, what is its scalability to be able to handle all of the traffic within that cloud that is being managed by the CSP? And if it can do that, then the third issue becomes, as I mentioned already, the ability to disaggregate all of that data that has been collected so that it can be given out to customers so that customers see only the traffic that is relevant to them and not other customers' traffic. And trying to ensure that all three of those things are done is pretty problematic today. Now, that's not to say that it can't be done or won't be done in the future, but this is not a widespread capability that's available today by any means. Again, this is a great question to ask of your provider or prospective provider and see what capabilities they actually have with regards to the ability to share security management, security monitoring data via a SIM for you, the customer.
Actually, Tim, I had lunch yesterday with one of the leading providers of a SIM provider, who to protect the innocent, and they're going to be launching a very specific cloud initiative in about 30 to 60 days. So that, to me, highlights that it's still a very immature area for SIM to just get into. They talked about potentially having a managed service operation, but they don't have the manpower to do that. How do we scale for something like that? The cloud service provider is all about minimizing headcount and automating. SIM, while it can automate log aggregation, it requires someone to actually physically look at it and react to it.
Yeah.
And so how you manage that will be interesting.
Yeah, I'm not very optimistic as far as existing products today to be able to handle both the scalability aspect and the disaggregation of data. There is one SIM provider who claims to scale to the cloud. I haven't seen any proof of that they can actually do it, and I'm aware of one SIM provider who actually does have the capability today to disaggregate their data for different customers, but trying to ensure that all of that is done in one SIM provider and that a CSP has actually deployed that on their public network for their customers, that's not something that's readily available today.
Tim, there was one more question, but I think we'll have to hold that for later, or maybe we can cover it towards the end. So I think thanks for those answers.
Okay, and just a reminder that we will be doing a wrap-up of questions at the end, so we'll come back to some of these that we don't get a chance now. So with that said, thank you very much, and I'm now going to turn it over to my co-author, my colleague here, Subra Kumaraswamy, who's going to take a deep dive on identity and access management. So, Subra, please.
Thank you, Tim. Good morning. My name is Subra Kumaraswamy. I am with Sun Microsystems. I'm managing the internal aspects as well as some of the customer-facing, so I can relate a lot of these issues, as well as some of the issues that is faced by cloud service providers. That includes Sun at some point. Okay, so in this discussion, we'll be focused on three aspects. The first one would be authentication and federation. First one will be provisioning, followed by authentication and federation, followed by authorization. Tim talked about data security issues and a wide range of issues from key management to data integrity. We believe that identity and access management is going to play a key role in enabling customers adapting cloud services, as well as to manage security and compliance. So I think it's very important that customers pay attention to every aspect of identity and access management, starting with provisioning, all the way with the lifecycle management of user access and compliance. So in this slide, you can see a typical enterprise, how they access cloud. We all know that the trust boundaries are shifted with cloud services, which means enterprise user can access a cloud service and use a cloud service just from a browser going directly to any cloud services out there. That includes Salesforce.com as a SaaS service, or a platform as a service like Google App Engine, or an infrastructure as a service that includes Amazon Elastic Cloud, or Rackspace or GoGrid. So we got three different cloud deployment models. So I will make an effort to touch upon what does it mean from your perspective for each of those deployment models and what you can expect from cloud service providers. This slide indicates how a customer of cloud service should be viewing identity and access management. So as you can see, there are two pillars. The first pillar is the end user access in the amber. And to the right, you can see there is the end user access control. The first pillar is the privileged access, and to the right is the end user access. When I say privileged access, I'm referring to super users, system administrators, workflow administrators, anybody who has privileged access for provisioning users, for provisioning access control. And similarly, from an end user perspective, it is simply about how the user can use a cloud service based on their job description, based on the job functions. So if you're, for example, if you're accounts payable, what you can expect from a cloud service versus a system administrator who is managing the cloud. And this kind of helps you to understand the different layers that you should be looking at, starting at the lower layer of abstraction from a network to compute and storage to database and application web services. And for each of these layers, you have to think about how do you manage access control for both end user and privileged users. Now, one of the things about cloud is that it does offer the economy of scale by way of automation. So it's very important to understand what API the cloud supports, especially the API that supports the standards, which I'll talk about briefly. And those standards should help you to do automation in the area of provisioning, authentication, authorization, and auditing. Without that, it's going to be very hard for customers to scale across many different clouds. So what is the current state of the identity and access management in the cloud today? Again, this is in the context of public clouds. Of course, enterprises that have been investing in identity and access management within the enterprise, they are probably much better off in adapting to cloud services. And that will pay off eventually when they go to public clouds. So the current state of public clouds is still much to be desired. Starting with provisioning, today the provisioning is very much a proprietary scheme, which means that for every cloud, you have to think about how do you provision users. Whether you're provisioning one user or 1,000 users, you still have to think about how you can automate that. Strong authentication, today, when I say strong authentication, I'm referring to two-factor authentication, such as one-time passwords, smart cards with PKI certificates. Today, there are only maybe a handful of cloud service providers who might offer strong authentication. And that, again, those strong authentication would be proprietary from a point of process management. If you want to leverage your internal infrastructure and processes, it's highly recommended that you leverage your infrastructure that includes federation, that includes provisioning and access management. The profile management in clouds are still very coarse. So, for example, when you provision a service with certain cloud service provider, you may end up finding that there are only two profiles, such as administrator with a highly, with high privileges, such as super users, and end user who are consuming the web service through a browser. Let's talk about cloud provisioning. SPML stands for Service Provisioning Markup Language. This is a standard that was ratified by OASIS and is being widely accepted as industry standard for provisioning. In this use case, as you can see, a company administrator would like to provision a user in the cloud. And with SPML, it gives you a notation syntax by which you can communicate to the cloud service providers the user information that includes user attributes and potentially user profiles. So what is the current state of provisioning? Today, enterprises are struggling with proprietary connectors, which means that for every single cloud service provider, enterprises are forced to invent a custom adapter. In some cases, there are adapters supplied by the cloud service providers, and you're in luck in those cases. but you still have to have some integration in your lifecycle management of users. So if you take the example of Salesforce.com or Google Apps or Workday, every provider provides a way of provisioning users. And for you to scale for all these clouds, you'll have to make sure that you have a common platform, and that's where we have SPML that comes into the picture. Even if SPML is supported, you may find out that the schemas that are supported by each of these providers may be unique, but having an investment in a common framework will help you scale across the providers. When I talk about provisioning, the most important aspect is offboarding. When an employee leaves the company or contractor leaves the company, it's very important that the access is disconnected and deprovisioned from the cloud service providers at the same time as the employee leaves the company. A typical enterprise will have a directory deployed, such as Active Directory or LDAP, and you may have a process by which the services are, the users are deprovisioned on time. But in the cloud, you still have to make a request and communicate that information that the employees have left the company. So it's very important to understand the controls involved in deprovisioning. Today, again, some of these are manual, and we hope to see more of SPML adapted to help that. Sequencing is sequencing of access is another area of concern. When I say sequencing, what are the steps required in setting up a user for an application? For example, a cloud service provider may have many different business modules, and it may be important to follow a certain sequence by which you have to set up a user on the cloud so the user can access those services. So if it is if you take the example of accounts payable versus accounts receivable, and if there are two different modules that are supported in the cloud, the way you provision may make a difference in the access control. Let me talk a little bit about the desired state. As I said early on, SPML is the industry standard for provisioning, so it's important that we support the cloud service providers support SPML for account provisioning. And SPML allows you to provision end-user identity information along with potentially profile information. The desired state for user administration is to have a delegated administration, which means that the service providers allows you as a customer to provision as many users as you want using an adapter. So it doesn't mean that you have to go to a website, a cloud service provider provide portal to do that. If they can do that through an API, you can leverage your existing processes and tools to do the same. The interesting aspect of cloud services today is that there is an emergence of third-party cloud service providers, which means that you can have a third-party provider helping you manage the identities in the cloud. The examples are simplified, ping identity, TriCipher, and these identity services in the cloud act as a proxy and help you hide some of the complexity dealing with provisioning. And for example, if a cloud service provider has an adapter that is unique to the provider, you can from your perspective, you're only talking to the identity service provider, and from the provider acting as a proxy for you, will be able to talk the right protocols, do the right handshakes to make sure the users are provisioned. We definitely want to see more fine granular access. And a lot of the companies are used to having a very good hierarchical role management, and it's very important to go to a desired state of having the same level of controls, fine granular controls in the cloud. And lastly, it's very important to have a trusted identity source. What I mean by this is that having a good source that includes, for example, HR, makes you, gives you the leverage to use that as a source when provisioning users to various providers. So having a good centralized identity store, a single source from which you can federate data within the enterprise, and that allows you to help extend that into the cloud. I've seen a lot of companies where they struggle with this issue, and you end up with duplicate attributes, you end up with duplicate identities, and makes deprovisioning very, very difficult. So I think as part of the preparation, it's very important for enterprises to think about a good, trusted identity source. So what do we do until, I know this is one of the early stages of the adoption here, until the cloud service providers get to the desired state, what can you do to manage risk? What can you do to manage the compliance and efficiency? We believe that the adoption of SPML will take between 2 to 5 years, and this is, again, this is just a pure research perspective, and we are basing it on the fact that SAML took almost that much time in the last decade. We saw the emergence of SAML, and I'll talk about SAML in the next slide. So we believe that the provisioning standards are just coming up to mark, so we do believe that customers are going to be left to their own schemes to manage provisioning. When possible, use the SPML adapters supplied by the providers, so you don't have to reinvent this within your enterprise. This allows you to leverage the customer's API. Periodically audit the users, and this, again, for lack of automation, you may have to fall back on auditing the logs, access control logs, making sure that there are no unauthorized users who are lingering around, making sure that the privileges match to the user profile. So when employees do move between the departments, the appropriate privileges are assigned or deassigned from the profile. And as much as possible, you should automate this process to scale. I think, again, the mantra here is that you have to think, when you think of cloud, you have to think of automation for both efficacy and efficiency. Let's move on to the next big identity function in the cloud, which is authentication, and with that comes federation. The, again, desired state, so that you don't have to duplicate your user ID and password across the cloud. We'll find out what the current state is and what the guidance is. As I mentioned earlier, from the point of authentication, it's very important to have a strong authentication. Recently, Windsor from Google mentioned that it's very important to have strong authentication, and it is a very critical element for cloud adoption. And strong authentication is really an anchor to provide trust for endpoints. Today, the strong authentication is not widely supported, something that as I mentioned, that you may have to fall back on your strong authentication infrastructure. Password strength policies are inconsistent. So if you have a strong password policy within your enterprise, you may want to understand how that maps to the cloud provider. And if the cloud provider stores those passwords encrypted or clear text, the easy way to find it out is to ask for a password reset. And if you see a password comes back in clear text, that's a big red flag to me, because that means that the provider has the ability to decrypt the password, or they have stored the password in clear text. On the other hand, if you're just getting a link which says, reset your password or a random password, one-time password, it gives you much better confidence on the provider. Federation is not widely available, and that's one of the things that I mentioned early on, is that federation support
Hi, everyone. Yes, the audio just died. Actually, I think that Shahed was disconnected, and if we just give him a moment, he'll dial right back in. I mean, Subra was disconnected. It was listed as Shahed. So, yes, I noticed that it was slowing down quite a bit, and I don't know what the issue is. So if you'll just allow a moment, we'll be able to, we'll have the panelists dial right back in. yes, darn those cloud services. It's a funny comment. So we'll just stand by, and they'll be right back. In the meantime, I hope that you all can join us for tomorrow's webcast. It's actually going to be quite good. Sustainable Networks by our author of the book, Sustainable Network. Her name is Sarah Sorensen, and it should be good. It's using ICT for your business to sustain your network, and that should be a great one. We also have one, if you're interested. So are you people hearing me? Okay, you are hearing me then. Okay, because I am seeing the sound thing. Great, thank you. Sometimes it gets a bit iffy sitting here talking out into the great cloud with no response. So Shahid says they're going to dial back in. So no, I can't take over the presentation because sadly my knowledge of cloud security doesn't even touch these guys. But I wish that I could. I could talk to you about running Webcast, but I don't think that's why you're here. So we'll just bear with us, and they'll be right back. So I wanted to tell you, if you're interested, I mean, these guys are definitely an expert on the subject. If you're interested in their book, we have a great discount that you can use not only on their book, but on any books you purchase from O'Reilly. It's just use the code FORECAST. Oops, I put that in the wrong. Send that to the wrong folks. Just use the code FORECAST when you check out, and you will get a 40% discount on your entire book purchase, or you will get a 50% discount on ebooks that you purchase for us. So it's a great deal. I don't think you can find a better discount anywhere. The weather right now, I'm afraid, has been really, really stormy. I was worried this morning that we might lose our power here, which, being on laptops, that wouldn't really affect our connectivity unless the routers went down or the phone system went down. So we'll just, right now it's a bit clearer. So where is everyone else from joining us today? Hawaii, how nice. Seattle, New Hampshire. I'm surprised. Usually we often get people from all over the world, including Australia and New Zealand, which is pretty amazing because you have to get up pretty early or stay up pretty late to join these presentations. Where is Namas Janaka? I have no idea. Probably showing my ignorance. No, 5 a.m. start for you guys in New Zealand. Well, fortunately, New Zealanders are all early risers, I hear. So it's not a problem for you. So let me check with our presenters and see. Sussex, England, how nice. I bet it's cold there, though. Here they are. All right, everyone, thank you so much. What a great group. So I'm going to unmute our presenters and pass it back to them. There you go, folks.
Hello, I'm back. Sorry about the disruption. We're having some phone difficulties. I'm on a mobile phone, so apologize for any kind of static or quality inconsistency. So as I was talking about Authentication Federation, the very things to think about, the key is to make sure the vendor, the cloud service provider supports SAML version 2. There are some inconsistencies where some providers support an older version of SAML, and that's where you have to rely on a gateway protocols, multi-protocol to hide the complexity. And since we're running short of time, I have to hurry up on some of these slides here. The desired state, as I mentioned, it's very important that the cloud service provider support the standards such as SAML. The other thing that you have to keep in mind is passwords has to be something that configurable for your passive policies, so you can apply the same stringent internal standards to the cloud service providers. You have to make sure that the authentication is externalized from the application, and this applies a lot when you're deploying applications on a platform as a service or an infrastructure as a service. So there are hooks that you rely on rather than building in authentication silo with the user ID and passwords for that application. It's also important that you could leverage user-centric applications or services such as OpenID. This allows you to choose authentication services versus relying on a cloud service provider's specific authentication scheme. And so what do you do in between until you get to desired state? Make sure that you have a good encrypted communication channel between your endpoint, i.e. the browser, and the cloud service provider. So it's very common that every login pages have SSL enabled, but doesn't mean that you can take it for granted. So this allows you to make sure the passwords and credentials are not sent in clear text. Tim talked about the key management issues, and it's also important that the keys are rotated frequently or on some even basis. So, for example, if you have a layoff in the company, or if your contractors are given a boot, you may want to think about rotating the keys such that the privilege access is restricted to only authorized employees. Federation gateways is an important architectural consideration. There are identity and access management federation products out there, including OpenSSO, that does support multi-protocols. So it's having an understanding what the product is capable of supporting in terms of multi-protocols will help you choose the right cloud service providers. By default, it should be the privileges should be at the least privilege and be able to log up to manage the access control. So example is having a role-based access control or sudo. And now we'll jump briefly to the authorization profile management. So this, again, we talked about provisioning, where you provision users with certain profiles, followed by authentication and federation. But what authorization allows the end users, our privileged users, to do is be able to access applications based on the user profiles. And having a good authorization story is important. Now in terms of support, you'll see a lot more support for authentication than authorization. And the customers are left to their proprietary authorization scheme supported by cloud service providers. So the current state, XACML, which stands for the Policy Expression Language, and this is the language that is ratified by WIASIS, is the preferred language to express policies. However, XACML is non-existent in cloud, and there are a lot of internal products, internally deployed products that support XACML. So the current state is that cloud service providers are not supporting those policies. OAuth is another protocol. This is, again, an open protocol for authorization between cloud services. For example, if you have Google apps as an example, where Google could be able to import data from, say in this case, Salesforce.com, having an OAuth support by Salesforce or vice versa allows you to import information such as your preferences without really disclosing your credentials to third party. So this OAuth is a protocol that I think you should be watching out for and taking advantage of wherever it's supported. Access control policies are not portable. This is another issue when how do you manage access control for users who are moving between clouds? The desired state, like I said, XACML is is the standard by which you should be thinking about policy management. XACML also allows you to port the preferences and profiles across cloud service providers once they start adapting it. Having good role-based access enables compliance, so meaning that if you can identify the privileges for each of your users and be able to segregate based on the functionality, will allow you to support key complaints such as the segregation of duties, which is required by SOX. Let's talk about some of the guidance until we get to the desired state. Try to standardize as much as possible on XACML and SAML. Again, these are two key standards for both authentication and authorization. Leverage as much as possible cloud service APIs. Configure virtual machines and applications in least privilege model, which means that when you are deploying virtual machines, make sure that you provision users that have different privileges, starting from your administrator who can do certain things with virtual machines, as opposed to an end user who may be using that virtual machine either for computation purpose or storage purpose. Leverage OAuth wherever possible. Again, I think OAuth is something that will help you reduce the exposure on the credentials and allows you to move across providers without really re-authenticating. In conclusion, there are 4 standards to look out. Starting with provisioning, that's the SPML. For federation authentication, leverage SAML, and for authorization, leverage XACML and OAuth. And demand the service provider support standards so you can actually scale your internal operations. You can make your entities portable across the clouds, and try to resist customization as much as possible. Again, anytime you customize, you end up managing it for a long time. So having a standard way of doing provisioning, authentication, authorization will not only allow you to scale, but also manage security and compliance. And finally, IAM can accelerate cloud adoption. And in fact, IAM could also be a barrier for adoption. So having a good internal IAM strategy and architecture that allows you to manage user lifecycle, access lifecycle, will help you scale across cloud, reduce the risk, and also reduce the cost eventually. I think we're running out of time on the identity access management, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand off to my colleague Shahid, and I'll take the questions at the end of the session. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. I'm just going to put you on mute for a few minutes because we've now got our landline back here. We just had a lot of severe weather storm here, and so we're going to go to a landline.
Here, so hopefully we've got better sound quality.
Okay, so this is Shahid. Hopefully my accent's a little bit different to my other 2 colleagues. Being from England, I hope it is still different. But what I'm going to talk to you in the next 25 minutes or so is an auditor's perspective on the use of the cloud. I'm sure we've covered in the last hour a lot of topics around IAM and data security, but often a driver to solutions are audit requirements and compliance. So I thought it might be useful for you for me to explain to you an auditor perspective of how they would look at the cloud. Some of this you might find interesting, some of it may not be relevant to you, but I think it's important to look inside the mind of an auditor, if that's possible, just to see the types of considerations they will be going through. So in terms of the agenda I'm going to set the stage for what audits are going to be looking like, what the key challenges are, some reporting options, and give you a closing remark. So in terms of setting the stage for audits, There's a planning consideration, there's fieldwork considerations, the user specialists, and there's also reporting requirements. Traditionally, those are fairly straightforward, and it's a fairly simple process. But if you apply these concepts to the cloud, it becomes all of a sudden different. Now, for example, planning considerations, scoping, you no longer have IT resources that reside in your company's location, your customer's location. It's residing at a third-party location. How do you get access to it? How do you even know the scope of the environment to which your customer's data is? So if you're the auditor of company A, how do you know, the case study that Tim showed you earlier, how do you know all those environments that are sitting out in the cloud providers, whether it's Workday, whether it's Amazon or Salesforce, how do you know what environment you're looking at? Timing. Data is dynamic. It's changing all the time. It's not even sitting on the same servers all the time. It's moving from server to server, from node to node, from network to network. When do you do an audit? Historically, you could pick a point in time, but is that now relevant, especially if you use an on-demand basis? If you're using it for 2 months and then switch it off, when do you audit it? When you use it or come back later? Those are all considerations you need to look at. Fieldwork considerations. Where do you conduct the audit? What type of audit evidence is going to be relevant for you? The reliance on the third party, obviously you're going to rely on the cloud service provider, but how do you do that? And user specialists. Do auditors or accounting firms or auditing firms have people that truly understand the cloud? If you look at the likes of Google and Salesforce and Microsoft and others, they don't have client-server environments. They have a much more dynamically changing set of landscapes, hypervisors and operating systems linked to that, and multi-nodes and virtualization, a new dimension of technology, and also with that controls. And then finally, reporting. So there's clearly a lot to think about when you're looking to audit the cloud. This looks quite like a busy slide, but I wanted to share with you how Sarbanes-Oxley 404 is looked at and how the cloud might be impacted by that. Some of you, I think one of you asked questions about, well, if the data is unstructured and unclassified, then surely where's the reporting needs coming out? The issue is that most clients don't necessarily always classify their data, and there's some data that may be relevant to the audit. If you look at CRM, which is probably the most relevant topic to SOX, there may be some billing data, or there may be some contractual data that's residing in the CRM tool itself. And so there's certain particular information that's needed, either it's for audit evidence or whatever. There may be need to look at that type of data. And obviously CRM, there's a large adoption of Salesforce solutions around the world today. So looking at this particular stage for the audit, I'm trying to give you an appreciation of how a SOX IT project would look like. On the far left, you see in-scope items, business processes, a risk control matrix, TOD is test of design, TOE is test of operating effectiveness. This will allow you to put your arms around how many processes are in scope. From there are application controls. From the application controls comes your IT environment, application, databases, operating systems, and hardware. They formulate your IT environment. PCOB is Public Company Oversight Accounting Board. That's an organization that the government put in place to regulate the auditors. They've stipulated 4 control dimensions: program development, program change, computer operations, access to program and data. That's the other dimension that is looked at over the IT environment. Now, I'm not going to explain all the other slides so you can see it there in front of you, but what this shows you is the universe a SOX auditor would look at when looking at how to audit a particular customer. Now, if you look at the next slide, and I'll come back to this slide in a minute, but if you look at the scope, and I'm going to pick software as a service as an example because it's the most embedded solution of all the 3 SPI models that we talked about earlier. That's the 3 SPIs being software as a service, platform as a service, and infrastructure as a service. You can see here that the boundary line is changing. If you look at things like ICT's technology stack, you can see the things above which the customer is responsible for, but there's less control over the things below that boundary line. I'm not going to read it all because you can see it in front of you, but just some examples: change in configuration management, delivery management. You'll have less control of those in a SaaS model because your software is being managed by the cloud service provider, the vendor themselves. So when you look at this environment, and I'll come back to this slide, you have to relate, okay, I no longer have direct access to that environment. Historically, I always had, but now I'm not going to. So how do you relate this to that environment is the auditor's consideration. So they will apply the same set of stringent controls, the same set of control requirements that PCAOB have laid out, and apply them to this environment. The difficulty will come in terms of real-time evidence. It'll come in the boundaries, pushes the data away from the customer and directly to the vendor. So how do you deal with that type of complexity? So that's the nature of some of the impact of the cloud on audit scope. Some other things to think about, just to summarize some of the other issues to think about between traditional techniques and I think what will need to be revised, and I've talked about some of them. The boundaries of audit are well understood. In fact, it's been going on for over 100 years. System-based auditing, compliance versus substantive auditing are well understood. However, the boundaries in the cloud are vastly different and requires almost a change in mindset to apply the audit approach to it. There's always been a changing IT landscape, but it's changing in months or years. It's relatively slow compared to the cloud, which is dynamically changing, constantly changing. The reliance in SAS 70s is there in the traditional audit technique, but because, as I mentioned, the dynamically changing environment, the shared environment, the multi-tenancy that's out there, the SAS 70 I don't think is going to work because it's not going to be relevant to your environment. Your data is constantly changing. The controls they're going to give you in the SAS 70 are going to be so high level, they're not going to be able to be relevant to what the audit comfort would need. The look-back audit approach, auditing after the event. As I talked before, auditors often pick sample sizes throughout the year and get comfort the controls working. How do you do that in a cloud when the data has already moved on? You have to change the style and approach. Maybe it is relying on the process and getting comfort that the process is working, but because the environment is constantly changing, how do you get comfort that the process is constantly being applied? Very, very challenging. Transaction-based auditing. A lot of the audits that go on today are very transaction-oriented, but I think that the move will have to go to process-based auditing in the cloud because it's the only way to deal with it. Ability to isolate hosted facilities to audit. You may be using an outsourced provider, you may have an ASP. It's isolated because you know where it is, there's a boundary around it, you know physically where the data is. But in the cloud, in a multi-tenant environment, it could be residing anywhere. As long as you're talking to the CSP, you'll know what it is, but it could be potentially anywhere, and you need to understand what the implications are around that. Clearly, in the traditional audit techniques, there are niche regulatory needs. If you're healthcare versus financial versus retail, there are specific regulatory needs. But what the cloud will do, it will open up the issues of global trans-border transactions and bring into issue of privacy even more so, because the nature of the cloud is all about moving data rapidly across borders, and that will create challenges for you from a privacy perspective. And then finally, audit evidence is readily available somewhat today, but in the cloud, you're going to have to rethink how we collect that audit evidence. What is sufficient to meet the needs of the auditor is going to have to be looked at. So as I hopefully showed you, there's a new dimension and rethinking of how to audit the cloud components today. Some of the key areas I want to talk now about, what's going to be impacted by the cloud. It depends what your customer is. If the customer is a cloud service provider, that's one thing. But I'm assuming in this case that perhaps the customer we're talking about is just a user of the cloud. In such cases, there could be slight differences. The top half of this slide talks about the cloud service provider. So for a cloud service provider, revenue recognition, the order-to-cash cycle, taxation, and legal structures will be significantly impacted by the cloud. The revenue recognition, for example, instead of being maybe for a software company traditionally have been very seasonal or quarterly driven by quarterly results, all of a sudden on demand through SaaS or software as a service, you may see revenue much more streamlined and much more constant. Maybe peaks due to activities in the market, but probably a leveling out of revenue and not a peaking that there is today. But say if you're a user of the cloud, what could change? The procurement process could change. Right now, when you buy a laptop, you go through a procurement process that requires expenditure approval, and it happens. In some cases, depending if you use, for example, platform as a service or infrastructure as a service, the cost may go below your authorization limits. So you could, for $10 or $50, provision a certain set of resources with a credit card. All of a sudden, you're provisioning very critical infrastructure and bypassing some of the procurement controls. So procurement process has to be rethinked in this cloud world. The corporate structure, depending on the use of the cloud, you may rethink your location of your data center may not be as important anymore because you're going to reduce its burden. So you may think about the corporate structure of IT as a service provider, how are you going to deal with that going forward? Organizational changes. One of the thought processes out there, or the school of thought, is that could the cloud really change the role of IT in an organization? Can the IT department exist as it is today if all of a sudden a lot of the services go into the cloud? I would guess to say that probably not. If no longer do you need a DBA, no longer do you need someone to do all your backups, no longer do you need someone to do all those shift transfers over from one ops to another ops team, because you're going to have the cloud manager environment. You're going to have your cloud have the infrastructure. They're going to do that for you, and therefore all of a sudden all the skills you have today may start to dissipate and change. It would happen overnight. In some cases, it might for some companies, but the bigger enterprises probably will take some time to make that change. Vendor management. How do you monitor your vendor? The service level agreements, the monitoring around that, how do you go about measuring it? And what do you measure, and how often do you measure, and who measures it, and who's accountable to it, are really important things to be considered in the audit process. Key IT processes that I think that need to be looked at quite carefully when you're adopting the cloud. The software development lifecycle. If you start using the platform as a service, and I guess to a degree infrastructure as a service, how does your software development lifecycle change? All of a sudden, from spending months debating architecture, you could provision services or resources within minutes and days. Incident response and monitoring. If something goes wrong, how do you know it goes wrong? How quickly do you get told by the cloud service provider? And business continuity. Does the cloud service provider back up your data? Do you have to pay extra for it? And if you do pay extra for it, what assurances do you have that it is backed up? And how do they provide that to you? So these are some of the traditional areas that are going to be impacted. The little diagram you see there on the right are some of the examples of things I'm already seeing in the marketplace. Email in the cloud, CRM in the cloud, HR in the cloud, web content filtering, vulnerability management. And you can see from our poll that we did at the beginning of this discussion, there seems to be a widespread of uses of the cloud. It's not one or the other. It's quite broadly spread apart. So just talking about some key challenges of the cloud, and I talked about them earlier. I won't spend a lot of time in this because I think I've touched on them earlier, but geographical locations, the definition of ownership and custodianship, the processing and the use of rights and obligations, the multi-tenancy aspects, the data seizure. I didn't talk about that yet, but let me talk about a little bit about that right now. Data seizure is all about that there could be a reason for the FBI or a governmental body to go into a cloud service provider and take data for investigation purposes. Because of the multi-tenancy environment, there's a high degree and high chance that they may take data of other customers as well. All of a sudden, then, because of privacy issues and accountability, that customer should be notified because he has accountability to notify if anyone else has that data, access to that data. My experience is, I think that what I'm seeing is that when data seizure occurs, often customers don't know that's going on. And so there's a big debate out there in terms of who is really truly responsible for that. Data loss. With so much reliance on the cloud, and the cloud may be taking over more and more of your data processing, you're creating a single point of potential failure. Now, the good thing is that they have a large amount of investment that will create fault-tolerant systems and failovers and hot backup sites, but ultimately something could go wrong. So to what degree is that data safeguarded and backed up? And then, as I mentioned earlier, dynamically changing systems. These are some of the major risk factors, and I alluded to the implications of those to the right, that need to be thought of when you're entering into the cloud. This slide shows, and I won't go into any detail because it's quite detailed, but I'm showing you new areas that auditors will look at with the cloud: virtualization, monitoring, multi-tenancy, data integrity, continuity, regulation, are just some of the areas that they will look at. What you see on the right are some specific examples of problems that we talk about in our book in some detail, but it highlights to you areas that are probably very new to most auditors and requires some understanding of technology to really embrace them and understand them. So I'm not going to walk you through these. I just wanted to just show them where you're on the page. You know, from IP aging to DNS attacks to the hypervisor and how secure the hypervisor is. There's a new dimension of security risks that need to be looked at if you're going to be relying on the cloud. I talked a lot about the issues, but now I want to just quickly turn to some of the solutions that are out there. ITGRC stands for Governance, Risk, and Compliance. And it's a model that's out there that's really a program, but there obviously is a software solution that provides this. And what I'm seeing is a lot of the Fortune 500 are adopting this. And in particular, a number of my cloud service providers, and I'll just name a few, Microsoft and Salesforce in particular, are using these GRC solutions right now to create a unified code of control compliance, having a unified compliance approach to how they address controls. So you can see here the concept of GRC is to have capabilities to effectively manage your risk, have real-time reporting, have real-time appreciation of the risk that's facing the organization. So I'll just give you one example because I could spend a lot of time on the slide. For example, if you're running a scanner at the network layer or the server level, you're probably running it, relying on SIEM to aggregate it, and then maybe on a regular basis, once a month or however, to look at the results. GRC gives you the ability to map all those logs to a control framework and tell you whether you're meeting or matching that control requirement. And it tells you real time as that data scanned is completely mapped to the controls, and it comes up on a dashboard, and it presents the results to you straight away. I see a lot of value in that going forward, and I truly encourage every client service I am talking to try to embrace this. And as a company, you can do it yourself as well and understand the boundaries of your controls. So GRC is definitely something there. This slide just shows you the common control frameworks that have changed from 2005 to 2007. A big change from internally developed frameworks to recognized frameworks. ITIL picking up. And I can tell you now 27001 is becoming very, very popular in the marketplace today. My final topic, and this is probably an interesting one because I know some of you asked questions on this. So what do we do about reporting? What type of reporting can we do? Today there's limited options. There's a SAS 70 Type 2, and currently there is another version being worked on for SAS 70 Type 2. But SAS 70 Type 2 has really been abused over the years. It's intended to be an order-to-order communication, not a marketing tool, but it's saying if company X has one auditor and company Y has another auditor, and then the cloud service provider just needs to issue one report that both auditors can rely upon. But what's happening is that some of the customers are saying, if you want me to do business, give me a SAS 70 so that I know you're secure. It's more intended to be an order-to-order communication than anything else. But because it's historical and because it's based on controls that are very high level, I question whether they're going to be adequate to meet the needs of the cloud and the risks that I presented to you and Tim and Subra have in there. The ISO certification, I definitely see an uptake in there. A number of the cloud service providers I'm working with have already become certified to 27001. I definitely think that's showing a layer of commonality in processes. Is it adequate? Probably not, because the ISO standards themselves are very debatable in terms of how granular you go with them, and whether they truly comply to them can be a discussion. But at least it's showing a consistent policy and a consistent framework to how to handle risk management, which is what 27001 tries to center around. What I believe is one of the things you should consider is ITGRC, governance risk compliance, that I tried to explain on the last slide, but it shows automating risk management, automating compliance, and managing compliance using automation and real-time information versus proactive manual reviews, and then making a report to the audit committee and saying this is what I'm finding, but rather a real-time automated fashion to how to manage your risks, and approaching it from a very pragmatic perspective. My closing remarks on unified compliance, and I want to end on this particular slide because it tries to encapsulate what cloud service providers should really think about. they need a very strong governance model. What program management and reporting capabilities they have to manage their risks. And there's three components I see: risk management, compliance, and continuous improvement that need to be looked at in this governance model. Below that, the foundation is unified control processes, common controls, whether they're outsourced or in-house, but understanding what they are, and then making sure they have linkages to those three components. If this type of framework is in place with a cloud service provider, they will be able to proactively manage their risks and prevent problems from occurring. So this is really, really important to try to adopt. This was my last slide, and I know I've just come to my time. I know there's two questions. Maybe, Tim, did you want to just ask the question?
Yes, we've had two questions come in with regards to Shahed's portion of the webcast this morning. And the first one, Shahed, is, will Google allow themselves to be audited by a third party?
So that's a good question, and I can give you some perspective because I had dinner last night with one of the chief information security officer for the products of Google last night, and I think I can share this openly because it was very public information. Google has a number of SAS 70s, which I believe Grant Thornton are the auditing firm around. They provide those to their customers when there's a need of compliance. He's also acknowledged that they are embarking upon a program of compliance. Historically, they have had a very high-level approach to compliance, but they're investing more and more time in compliance. They are also considering 27001. I don't think that Google will be open to be audited by a third party directly unless you're a very strategic partner or have a strategic relationship with them. But I think it would be extremely difficult for that to allow because Google is trying to protect its multi-tenancy environment by saying no one is allowed access to it. So you will find some difficulty, but I think it comes back to your relationship and understand the boundaries between what they monitor and what you monitor, what your service level agreements are, and to what degree you can audit those and get assurances those service levels are met. I know my firm does quite a lot of work with Google, and so it is possible to get a third party on behalf of someone else to do a review, but it all depends on the circumstances of the request.
Well, it's interesting, Shahed. Now, Google has said that they are going to segment part of their public cloud for use to the federal government, and in effect have a private cloud that is dedicated to the federal government. So it will be interesting to see if the federal government imposes some sort of audit standards on Google for that now private cloud, or soon-to-be private cloud, that Google's going to dedicate to the federal government, and therefore will that then, in effect, set the standard for Google to be audited in their public cloud as well?
It's a good question. I do know that they're considering FISMA requirements right now. And as you probably know, Tim, the FISMA requirements are not high level by any stretch of the imagination and requires a SSP to be developed, which could be like a 300 to 400 page document of detailed control requirements, very focused on security.
And FISMA being the Federal Information Security Management Act there. We had a second question come in for you, please, Shahed, with regards to CSPs and which ones are 27001 compliant today. And of course, that would be ISO 27001.
So I can't give you the full laundry list because I haven't done the research on who's compliant, but I can tell you those that are either embarking upon it or already certified. So Workday already have an active program. They're a cloud provider in the HR space, and they're already working towards a 27001 and been doing it for the last almost 8 months. Salesforce.com, I already know, is 27001 compliant. Microsoft is already also down that path as well. I know Google is looking into it, but they're not yet compliant. I'm not familiar enough with Amazon to know whether they're compliant or not, so I can't answer that question. But those are some of the major ones that I'm aware of. So, Tim, I think those are the major questions. Were there any other questions?
Yes, there's a couple of other ones that have come up with regards to regulating the cloud. If companies aren't putting any regulated data in the cloud today, where is the push for regulation coming from? My short answer to that would be is there are companies, for example, financial services companies, who would like to put more data in the cloud, but don't feel comfortable doing so today because there are no regulations established for such. So there is some work going on, as I mentioned. One of the 4 financial services auditors, or regulators, pardon me, is developing regulatory guidelines for their, I'll call them constituents. I know that they are also consulting with the other 3 federal regulatory agencies as well. So certainly the regulators in the United States, at least, are looking at what is this thing called cloud computing, and if companies are going to use it, what do I need to do to regulate that? So there is some work being done on that, but as of today, there are no regulations that are directly pertinent to cloud computing. Now, NIST is also, NIST being the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, a U.S.-based organization, government entity, is doing some work into cloud computing as far as potential standards, and really trying to help the federal government understanding what cloud computing is. But NIST has no role in setting regulations, certainly not for the cloud nor anything else. So, again, it's primarily coming from federal financial regulators today.
Well, I think you answered it mainly probably the way I would, Tim. The only thing I would answer in terms of the push and where it's coming from, it's going to come from a number of directions. But as I said earlier, I believe CRM, which is actively being used, CRM itself has very specific information that relates to financial reporting. There are certain information already in this CRM tool that auditors need to look at. So if you're using CRM, whether you classify it structured or unstructured, from an auditor perspective, there's financial data that's needed to be looked at, and if it's not in the controlled environment, i.e. in your customer's environment somewhere else, auditors are going to get excited and want to know all about it. Email is an interesting thing because email is a basic communication vehicle for everyone, and sometimes the email system itself can be considered an authorization vehicle for giving approvals. You may send an email to approve something. An email by itself may constitute lots of problems. So, and Tim alluded to this earlier, but e-discovery around email is quite an expensive thing if not done well. And so think about this, that as your cloud service provider that's providing email in the cloud, do you have the ability to extract a string of characters or a string of information that you need? You might need all the emails from Tim Mather over the last 3 years when he talks about the subject of cloud computing. How quickly can they get that information? And how reliable is it that they give everything to you and do it in a rapid way? In a multi-tenant environment, that is very hard to get hold of.
And Shahid, I saw one question that's probably very near and dear to your heart. It said about audit standards. Is there a unified compliance framework? Maybe this will come from NIST or from somebody else.
So I think someone asked this question earlier on the website, and I'm going to do a little plug for Cloud Security Alliance, and maybe Tim, you can talk a little bit about it. So there is no standards today, but if you look at general, there's not many standards anywhere. There's lots of different standards, but never a unified compliance standard. But one thing I see growing up, and maybe Tim, you can talk a little bit about it because I know you work closely with them, is there is a non-for-profit organization that started, I think, over a year ago, and it's called the Cloud Security Alliance. Maybe, Tim, you can elaborate a little bit about their charter and what they're trying to do, because I think that is addressing some of those topics.
Yeah, and Rob had asked the question along these lines with regards to, is there a body that is pushing on any of the cloud service providers as far as security is concerned? And as Shahid just said, the one body that is doing that in the United States is the Cloud Security Alliance, which is trying to be a vendor-agnostic, customer-focused group that is trying to raise the bar for cloud service providers as far as what they do for security purposes. For those of you who might be in Europe, ENISA, the European Network Information Security Agency, is also looking into cloud computing, and they've recently put out in November a very good report on cloud computing, specifically with regards to security. Now, ENISA, to my knowledge, doesn't have regulatory authority. They have advisory authority in the European Union. But do look at what ENISA is doing, and certainly for everyone, because the Cloud Security Alliance is not limited simply to the United States or strictly the United States. They are global in focus. So look at what they're doing and their efforts to push upon the cloud industry better security standards. One other question that came up with regards to regulation or related to regulation, I should say, is what about PCI and the use of the cloud? Now remember that PCI is not a regulation. It is a voluntary industry standard. Now that said, is there any any tie between PCI and use of cloud computing? At the moment, the PCI Security Council has not addressed this issue specifically, but if you look at their 12 requirements there, I'd be hard-pressed to see how several of those requirements can be met in a cloud computing environment. I will say that I have heard a vendor or two, cloud service provider vendor, claim to be PCI compliant. As of today, that's garbage. That's simply nonsense. There is no such thing as a PCI compliant cloud, nor are any cloud service providers PCI compliant. So be careful about that. And again, there are several of those 12 requirements that would be very difficult to meet in today's cloud environment, which augurs for a potentially regulated or community cloud, which would be devoted strictly to some of the regulatory frameworks, whether that be GLBA or HIPAA in the United States, whether that be PCI or some other type regulatory framework.
So, Tim, I think we're almost out of time, so I'm going to do what I always do, and I'm going to put a plug in for the book. So one of the reasons I appreciate everyone's time today, but please go out there on Amazon.com or on O'Reilly's website and buy the book. What you heard today is only a fraction of what's in the book, and it's been well received. There's a chapter that talks about what is the cloud. If some of you are still unfamiliar with it, there's about 35 pages that talks just about the cloud. There's another chapter about the examples of the cloud in some detail. So instead of trying to find it from the web and not sure if it's reliable, we spend a lot of time talking to the cloud providers themselves and putting this book together. So I would very much encourage you to go out there and get the book. Thank you for your time. I appreciate that your time is valuable. Hopefully you've learned some things today. We do have a blog site, so look up our names. You'll find it. If you have questions and things you want to throw our way, please do so. And we look forward to talking to you again in the near future. Thank you. Bye.